Do you ever wonder what your grandfather felt when he lost his job in 1932? Or what your grandmother cooked with nearly nothing left in the pantry? The 1930s weren't just a time in history books. They were lived. And for many, they're still carried quietly in the lines of a worn photograph, a family recipe, or the soft tremble in a story told by someone who was there. Welcome back to Sleepytown Radio, where the past drifts gently into the present, and where the quiet rhythm of memory becomes something you can feel, not just remember. Tonight, we travel back to one of the most challenging chapters in American life, the Great Depression. But this isn't a lesson in economics or dates. It's a walk through kitchens filled with cabbage soup, through homes where the warmth of a single room held a whole family close. It's about hobos riding freight trains through the night, mothers washing clothes on a wooden washboard, and children wearing shoes patched with old tire rubber. And yet it's not just about loss. It's about people, about how they endured, and more than that, how they held on to dignity, humor, and love when it seemed there was little else to hold on to. They didn't have much, but what they had, they shared. A loaf of bread, a warm room, a radio humming stories through the static. The spirit of the 1930s wasn't just about survival. It was about holding the family flame together. If you're lying in bed tonight, maybe a little restless, maybe looking for something slower, something quieter, stay with us. You're about to hear a story not just of hardship, but of extraordinary resilience, told with the kind of tenderness that can only come from remembering. So close your eyes if you'd like. Let the fire crackle in the distance, and let us take you back to a time when neighbors leaned on one another, when joy was simple, and when strength was often found in the smallest, quietest moments, because the 1930s weren't just survived, they were lived and remembered by a generation who taught us what it really means to endure. They say you could feel it before you could name it. Something in the air shifted. First, it was a neighbor who lost their job, then a cousin, then your own father. The laughter around dinner tables grew quiet. The front porches where folks once sat each evening stood empty. By the early 1930s, America was a country holding its breath. The crash of 1929 wasn't just a market collapse. It was the sound of certainty vanishing overnight. One moment, people were living modestly, but with hope. The next, their savings were gone. Their jobs disappeared, and the future seemed to vanish too. Unemployment soared to unimaginable heights. 1 in every 4 adults jobless. Try to picture that. Imagine walking down a quiet neighborhood street and realizing that every 4th home is lit not by electric light, but by the dull flicker of worry. Breadwinners once proud and capable now waited in lines for food, scanned newspapers for any sign of work, and stared at their children with silent dread. It wasn't just the loss of income. It was a loss of identity. Men who used to wear suits to the office now searched alleyways for bottles to return for pennies. Women who once hosted Sunday dinners now stood in line at charity kitchens. Children learned far too early what it meant to be without shoes that fit, without milk on the table, without assurance that tomorrow would be any better than today. And yet, it didn't all come crashing down in a single moment. It crept in, slow and suffocating. One missed paycheck, one eviction notice, one factory closing, Hope didn't vanish with a bang. It faded, inch by inch. In the cities, long lines formed outside soup kitchens. In the countryside, farmers watched helplessly as prices for their crops plummeted, their harvests now worth less than the seeds they planted. And across every state, stories echoed the same tone. Loss, but also the stubborn will to keep going. In some ways, the Great Depression was more than an economic crisis. It was a test of the human spirit. And that's what makes this story worth remembering. Because for all the graphs and figures, what mattered most was how people responded. Some rode freight trains in search of any kind of work. Some took in relatives, shared their rations, and made one-bedroom sleep 6. Some bartered eggs for sugar, mended clothes beyond wear, and found new ways to survive in a world that no longer played by familiar rules. The banks had failed. The jobs had vanished. The nation was hurting. But behind every closed door, in every quiet kitchen, families were learning how to stretch, how to share, and how to endure. This was not a chapter of flashy inventions or bold new cities. It was a time of keeping the lights on with oil lamps and making do with less. A time when smiles were a little rarer, but somehow more real. It's easy to look back now with the comfort of distance. But if you listen closely, the echoes of the Great Depression are still here, in the cautious savor, in the homemade quilt passed down, in the stories your grandmother told while snapping beans by the window. And as we move forward in tonight's story, you'll meet some of those people, the wandering men who left home to chase distant work, the mothers who held households together with grit and grace, and the communities that found joy in shared meals and radio shows when money couldn't buy happiness. Because the Great Depression wasn't just a fall, it was a reckoning. And from its deepest hardships rose some of the strongest examples of American perseverance we've ever known. So stay with us. The hardest years are just beginning, and yet, so are the quietest victories. The front door didn't slam. There were no goodbyes, just a quiet nod, and the soft creak of boots stepping off the porch. It happened in towns across America. Fathers, brothers, sons, men once rooted by duty and routine, stood up one morning and walked away. Not because they didn't care, but because they had to. The jobs were gone, the bills were mounting, and no matter how hard they searched, there was nothing left for them in the places they called home. With heavy hearts and empty pockets, they joined a growing migration of men who crisscrossed the country, not in cars, but on foot, or clinging to the side of freight trains. They were called Hobos, though many had never known homelessness before. These were men who once wore clean collars, who kissed their kids goodnight, who fixed fences and paid their dues. But now, they lived by the rhythm of the rails. The railway tracks became their highways, a map without names. They hopped boxcars beneath moonlight, crouching low to avoid the railway bulls, the guards who'd throw them off, or worse. They traveled cold, hungry, and often alone, town to town, state to state, always chasing the whisper of work that might or might not exist. Some carried signs, "Will work for food." Some simply carried a bedroll and the hope of a day's labor. And though the rails were long, the stories they shared were short and often the same. No work here. Try the next town, For every town that welcomed them with an odd job or a plate of stew, there were others that posted signs. No tramps, no handouts. It was a lonely life, harsh and uncertain. Nights spent sleeping under bridges or in hobo jungles, makeshift camps built near train yards, where tin cans boiled over open fires and old harmonicas sang into the dark. And yet, in the strange way hardship often does, these wandering men built a community of their own. They had a language, a code, carved symbols on fence posts or water towers that told the next traveler what to expect. A kind woman here, an angry sheriff there, work maybe 2 towns down. It's easy now to romanticize it. The wind in your face, the freedom of the rails. But truth be told, there was little romance in it then. Just hunger, cold, the ache of missing faces back home, and the gnawing worry that they had failed the very families they loved most, because at its core, this wandering wasn't about running away. It was about holding on to pride, to purpose, to the faint hope that somewhere out there a man might still find a way to provide, even if it meant risking his life climbing a moving train, or crossing an entire state just for the chance at chopping wood or harvesting crops. Some never made it back, some did. Older, thinner, quieter, and when they did return, they rarely spoke much of the road. Only a handful of stories. Maybe a name or two remembered. Maybe a scar or a song. But more often, just silence. The kind you learn to live with when the world has shown you how fragile everything can be. Their journeys weren't just physical. They were journeys through dignity, despair, and the raw edges of what it means to be a man in a time when manhood offered no guarantees. So the next time you hear the distant whistle of a train at night, maybe let your mind drift back to those quiet souls in dusty coats, riding toward the unknown, not out of recklessness, but out of love, because the hobos of the Great Depression didn't ride to escape. They rode to survive, for the people waiting back home, for the fire that still flickered on the hearth, and for the hope, however faint, that they could bring something back with them, even if it was just the will to keep going. While the cities wrestled with unemployment and empty factories, a different kind of devastation was unfolding far out in the Great Plains. There, the land itself began to give up, as if it too had grown tired. The Dust Bowl wasn't just a storm. It was a long, slow unmaking of everything that had once promised a good life. Crops stopped growing. The wind stopped whispering and started howling. And for the farmers and families who had built their hopes on the soil, there was nowhere left to turn. It began with drought. Season after season, the rains never came. The skies stayed high and hot and empty. The ground cracked open like old pottery, and the roots of the wheat, once golden, now brittle, crumbled in the sun. But it wasn't just nature. It was man, too. Years of aggressive plowing had stripped away the native grasses that once held the soil in place. Without deep roots to anchor the earth, every gust of wind became a thief, stealing topsoil by the handful, then by the acre. And then came the storms. Massive black clouds rolled across the horizon like smoke from a dying world. They didn't bring rain, only dust, thick, choking, endless. They called them black blizzards. And when they came, the sky turned the color of rusted copper. Noon looked like midnight. people covered their faces with damp cloths, stuffed wet rags around window panes, and prayed the wind would pass quickly, but it didn't. It lingered. And when the storm moved on, it left behind drifts of dust like snowbanks. In doorways, on beds, inside teacups left on the kitchen shelf. Some children woke up coughing with lungs full of grit. Others never woke up at all. Farm after farm failed. Barns stood empty. Animals perished. What was once a patchwork of vibrant life became a gray wasteland where even the air itself had turned against the people who depended on it. Mothers swept the same porch 3 times a day, only to find it blanketed again within hours. Fathers stood in fields that once fed hundreds, now unable to coax a single green shoot from the ground. And children learned early that there were places the wind could go, through doors, walls, dreams, that nothing could truly keep it out. The Dust Bowl forced families into impossible decisions: stay and risk starvation, or leave behind the only home they'd ever known. For hundreds of thousands, the answer came with tears and trembling hands. They packed what little they had, mattresses tied to the roof, pots clanking in the back of the truck, and pointed west toward California, where rumors promised jobs and harvests and hope. They weren't just escaping the dust. They were escaping the silence it left behind, the empty promise of land that no longer gave back. And yet, even in that bleakness, there were moments that clung to the light. Neighbors helped one another shovel out windows. Children wrote messages in the dust on classroom desks. Some families huddled together by oil lamps at night, telling stories to drown out the wind, stories that somehow kept the flame of hope flickering, even when the world outside was painted in ash. The Dust Bowl was more than an environmental disaster. It was a test of spirit, of endurance, of human faith, not in weather, not in economy, but in one another. And for many of those who stayed, and many more who left, it marked the beginning of a journey that would shape the rest of their lives, because leaving the Dust Bowl wasn't the end. It was the start of a long road west, a road filled with heartache, prejudice, makeshift camps, and desperate prayers, but also a road lined with strength. And in our next chapter, we follow those travelers, the ones called Okies. Not all were from Oklahoma, but all carried the weight of the same storm. All chased the same glimmer of a second chance. So let's walk beside them as the dust settles behind and the long road ahead begins to rise. They left behind more than land. Behind them lay abandoned barns, broken fences, empty cribs, and family names carved into mailbox posts that would soon be buried under dust. What they carried with them wasn't just luggage. It was loss. It was memory. It was hope, chipped and fragile, but still burning. They were called Okies. Not all of them came from Oklahoma. Some were from Kansas, Texas, Arkansas, but the name stuck, and with it, a stigma that would follow them all the way to California. These were families who had endured the Dust Bowl and had nothing left to lose. The rain hadn't come. The wheat had died. The cattle had starved. And so, with little more than old trucks, patched up tires, and whatever could be strapped to the roof, they set out west, following whispers of orange groves and steady pay. But what they found was something else entirely. The roads to California were long and punishing. Radiators boiled over beneath the desert sun. Children grew sick on bad water. Tires blew on unpaved roads. At night, they slept under the stars or under bridges, listening to the wind carry stories from other travelers. They're turning people back at the border now. No more jobs left. Keep driving. Try Fresno. And when they did arrive, dusty and worn and clinging to one another, they were met with suspicion. Locals saw them not as neighbors, but as threats. Cheap labor, dirty, uneducated, desperate. They were offered pennies for a day's work, forced to live in makeshift camps outside the towns they hoped to call home. Some camps had names like Pipe City, because people slept inside concrete culverts stacked like logs. Others were fields littered with tents made from old blankets and cardboard, where children played barefoot in the dirt, and mothers tried to stretch one tin of beans into dinner for 6. It was hard, unimaginably hard, but still they endured. Photographer Dorothea Lange captured their faces, furrowed brows, hollow cheeks, eyes that still looked forward. Her most famous image, Migrant Mother, showed a woman with her children clinging to her shoulders, the weight of the world tucked into the lines on her face. She wasn't posing. She wasn't pretending. She was surviving. And for every such image, there were thousands more untold. Fathers who picked crops all day and still came home with not enough. Teenagers who dropped out of school to help in the fields. Little boys who learned how to work a hoe before they learned to read. Whole families who chased the harvest north in summer and south in winter, sleeping in orchards and bathing in irrigation ditches. But even in that desperation, there was something quietly heroic. They didn't steal. They didn't riot. They didn't stop loving one another. They sang. They told stories. They patched each other's clothes and shared what little they had. And they kept going. One county to the next, one camp to another, chasing not just food, but dignity. John Steinbeck told their story in The Grapes of Wrath. But they lived it long before it was printed on any page. They lived it in dirt and sweat, in the way a mother folded her child's shirt at sundown, or the way a father taught his boy to hold a shovel just right. They were not just victims of circumstance. They were survivors of something greater, a national unraveling. And through it all, they reminded the country what strength could look like when everything else was gone. Tonight, as we remember them, we don't just picture dusty roads or hungry eyes. We picture courage. The kind of courage that doesn't shout or shine, but quietly holds a child's hand and says, "We'll find a way." And in the next part of our journey, we turn from the roads to the heart of the home, where mothers became the anchors, where pennies were stretched like miles, and where the fire of family still flickered, even in the coldest nights, because after the journey, there had to be shelter. And after despair came the quiet strength of those who refused to let their families fall apart. When the dust had settled, when the truck stopped rolling and the men came home empty-handed, it was the mothers who stepped forward, not loudly, not with grand declarations, but with quiet determination and hands that never stopped moving. In the 1930s, the center of the home wasn't the fireplace. It was the mother. She was the one who made the numbers work, even when they didn't. Who knew exactly how many pennies were left in the flour tin and how many meals that could stretch into? She was the soft voice that calmed frightened children, the strong arms that lifted laundry and hearts at the same time. When the world outside felt broken and uncertain, mothers became the keepers of routine, of dignity, of warmth. She was the one who knew how to patch a shirt so neatly it looked almost new. She could mend shoes with a piece of tire and still make sure her son felt proud enough to wear them to church. She cut hair with kitchen scissors, darned socks until the thread ran out and could turn a potato and onion into stew with more flavor than reason. And through it all, she held the family together. Every morning she rose before the rest, sometimes to knead bread, sometimes to sweep the fine dust that had crept in during the night. Always with purpose. Monday was wash day, scrubbing each garment by hand on a washboard until her knuckles ached. Tuesday was ironing. Wednesday might mean baking or boiling starch or walking 2 miles to barter for eggs. The work was endless, but she made it sacred, not because she had to, but because it was hers to do, and her family needed her. There wasn't time for rest. There wasn't room for complaint. Just the rhythm of survival, stitched together by her 2 hands. And when food ran low, as it often did, it was the mother who went without first. She'd say she wasn't hungry, that she'd already eaten. But the truth was simpler. Her children came first. Always, she learned tricks passed down from her own mother, adding oats to ground beef to make it stretch, boiling fruit rinds to make jelly, drying apple peels in the window just to have something sweet in the cupboard. And when there was no sugar left, she sweetened things with molasses or with her own voice, singing while she worked, humming lullabies to babies who cried from hunger they couldn't name. But she didn't just keep the stove warm, she kept spirits warm too. When the father sat silent at the table, head down from another day without work, she placed his coffee gently beside him. When the children asked when things would get better, she smiled and told them soon. She wasn't naive. She knew how bad it was, but she also knew that belief, even thin and fraying, was something that had to be protected. Sometimes she would trade stories with other mothers while hanging clothes on the line or kneeling in a garden. Shared laughter, shared worry, shared hope. They were strangers, yet sisters in the same unspoken fight. They swapped recipes, hand-me-downs, and advice on how to mend a child's spirit when the world offered no toys, no trips, no treats. Photographs from that time often show fathers looking away, boys looking down, but mothers looking directly into the camera, not with fear, not even with sorrow, but with steadiness. They were the eyes of women who had learned how to carry entire families on their shoulders without ever raising their voices, and behind closed doors, they gave their children something no paycheck could: the memory of being loved during the hardest time of all. So many years have passed since then. But maybe you still remember her. Maybe she was your grandmother. Maybe she was the woman who raised you. Maybe her hands once tucked you into bed, or packed your lunch, or wiped away your tears while the world felt too big to hold. She may not be remembered in textbooks, but in kitchens and living rooms across America, her legacy lives on, in how we fold our linens, how we stretch a meal, how we care for one another without needing praise. In the Depression, America nearly came apart, but in living rooms lit by oil lamps, mothers held the country together. In a 1930s home, There was no such thing as a weekend. Every day had a purpose. Every morning began with work. It started early, before the sun had finished rising, when the air still held the chill from the night before. Mothers, often already dressed in worn aprons and house dresses, moved quietly through the kitchen. The kettle on the stove, the smell of leftover coffee, the scratch of match to wood. These were the sounds that opened the day. Monday was wash day. The big galvanized tub was filled with hot water, heated carefully over the stove. Clothes were scrubbed by hand with soap flakes and a washboard. There were no machines, only strong arms and patience. Whites were soaked in bluing. Dark colors were hung on the line, flapping in the breeze like flags of resilience. By afternoon, her hands were wrinkled and raw, but the laundry danced dry in the sun, clean once more. Tuesday was for ironing. Flat irons were heated on the stove and used quickly before they cooled. Each shirt was pressed with care, each collar creased sharply, as if every fold could restore a little dignity. Even the youngest child had their Sunday shirt kept crisp, because even in poverty there was pride. Wednesday was mending and baking. Socks were darned, buttons were re-sewn, elbows patched and hems reinforced. At the same time, the kitchen was filled with the smell of fresh bread rising, perhaps just 2 loaves, enough to last through the end of the week. If there were apples, they might become a crumble. If not, flour and sugar became biscuits. Waste was not an option. Everything had a second life. Thursday meant cleaning. Dust from the plains crept in through every crack, so floors were swept, rugs beaten, and windows wiped with vinegar water. Children helped, sometimes willingly, sometimes not, but chores were part of living. A clean house was a small way to feel in control of an uncontrollable world. Friday was for planning and preparation. Mothers reviewed what food was left in the larder. What could be stretched? What could be spared? Perhaps a stew would carry over into the weekend, or a casserole made of beans and rice. Grocery lists were short, just the bare essentials if the family could afford them. Sometimes, neighbors would trade, eggs for potatoes, sewing for sugar. Community, not currency, kept many households afloat. Saturday brought a different rhythm. If the father had found work, even for a day, he might be gone early, walking miles to the job site. The children helped in the garden or chopped wood or fixed what needed fixing. It was the day for repairs and errands. If there was a little extra, perhaps the family went to town for a nickel movie or a visit to the library. But often, it was just a slower pace, a quieter day to be together. And then came Sunday, the day of rest, reflection, and reverence. Families dressed in their best, even if that meant a worn dress freshly washed and an old hat brushed clean. They walked to church, sat shoulder to shoulder, sang hymns with trembling voices. Afterward, there might be a modest meal, a roast if they were lucky, or soup and bread if not. But what mattered most was the togetherness. Sundays were sacred not just for faith, but for family. It was the one day of the week when time seemed to pause, when parents and children might sit on the porch together, listen to the radio, or simply watch the sky darken over the fields. In those days, there were no dishwashers, no microwaves, no delivery trucks bringing groceries to the door. Everything was earned, made, grown, or carried. But in every hour of every day, there was rhythm, there was order, there was love, stitched into routine. And as the week repeated, again and again, the family found strength not in ease, but in the quiet courage of daily living. From sunrise to sunset, from wash day to worship. This was life in a 1930s household, not easy, but deeply rooted, held together by tasks, by time, and by the gentle, invisible threads that only families could see. In a 1930s household, every item of clothing had a story. It wasn't just fabric stitched together. It was memory, necessity, and love sewn into every seam. After 6 days of chores, patching, and planning, Sunday dresses and weekday shirts still had to be worn. The worn cuffs, the faded collars, the missing buttons. None of it mattered, so long as they were clean and whole. That was the quiet dignity families carried through the Depression. Most children in that era never knew the feel of something brand new. Their clothing came from someone else, a brother grown tall, a cousin who'd moved away, a neighbor's act of kindness. The term hand-me-down wasn't said with shame. It was simply the way of life. A shirt that fit last year would be passed on, adjusted, and worn again. Patches were lovingly sewn, not hidden, but displayed as proof. This family made things last. Mothers became tailors in their own right. Old dresses were taken apart and reassembled into smaller frocks for younger daughters. Trousers with threadbare knees were cut into shorts, or repurposed for another child entirely. A flour sack, if the pattern was pretty, might become an apron, a doll's dress, or even curtains for a drafty window. Nothing was wasted. Everything was transformed. Shoes were sacred. A single pair had to last, often for an entire school year, or longer. Soles wore thin, heels caved inward. Fathers or local cobblers would patch them with anything they could find. Some used scraps of tire rubber. Others made makeshift insoles from cardboard. There were even stories of children walking barefoot to school, hiding their shoes in their satchels to preserve the soles until they reached the building. Wear and tear were part of growing up. Haircuts, too, were done at home. There was no money for barbers. Instead, a mother or father would sit a child down on a wooden chair, drape a towel over their shoulders, and begin snipping. The tools were simple: clippers, scissors, a comb, and a steady hand. Boys often wore their hair short and neat. Girls might get their bangs trimmed while long hair was braided or pinned up, especially during the summer heat. The styles weren't perfect, but they were practical, and they were done with care. In the mirror, a child didn't see imperfection. They saw mama's hands brushing their hair back. They felt the closeness of someone who loved them enough to try. And that, in those days, mattered far more than any fashion. For holidays or special Sundays, perhaps a ribbon was tied, or a dress mended with lace from something old. A boy might polish his shoes with bacon grease to make them shine. Appearances weren't about vanity. They were about self-respect. Even in hard times, people tried to look their best, and if a stranger passed by, no one could guess how little a family had, because what they lacked in newness, they made up for in care. Clothes were folded with pride. Hair was brushed each morning. Buttons were saved in a jar and sewn back on at night. And sometimes, Siblings would laugh as they passed on a favorite sweater, too small now, but rich with memory. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but in every thread and every trim, there was a quiet testament to survival and to the invisible bonds that held families together. As winter crept in and the winds howled across the Great Plains, these same clothes, patched, layered, repurposed, were worn again and again to keep out the cold. One coat might serve 3 children in rotation. Mittens were sometimes made from old socks. Blankets were shared, and when the cold became too much for even the thickest sweater, families did what they had always done. They came together, gathered in one room, shared stories, shared warmth, and waited for spring. That warm room with its glowing stove and gathered hearts is where we go next. As the days grew shorter and frost crept along the window panes, winter in 1930s America was not simply a season. It was a challenge of the soul, with money stretched thin and coal even thinner. Most homes couldn't afford to heat every room. So families did what they had always done in hard times. They adapted. They created what came to be known as the warm room. One space in the house, usually the kitchen or the parlor, became the heart of winter survival. It was where the stove sat, where the heat lingered longest, and where life folded itself into something smaller, but no less meaningful. By nightfall, everyone gathered there, babies in arms, grandparents in shawls, children wrapped in old coats that had once belonged to someone else. Blankets were layered on laps, and socks were doubled up. Quilts, hand-stitched over the years, became walls of their own, blocking drafts that slithered through the cracks in wood and glass. The heat source itself could vary. A wood-burning stove, a coal heater, sometimes just a fireplace with bits of kindling. When even those grew scarce, families turned to whatever they had. Corn cobs, dried and brittle, were tossed into the flames. Bundles of newspaper, twisted tightly, acted as fire logs. Some even burned dried-out dung from livestock, a method passed down from earlier generations. The warmth was never enough to make you forget the cold. It was just enough to keep it at bay. Children played quietly with homemade toys, a button on a string, a carved wooden animal, or maybe the pieces of an old jigsaw puzzle handed down through the years. Their breath fogged up the glass, and they would draw pictures in the frost. Silly faces, hearts, or their names, dreaming of a spring that felt a lifetime away. Meals, when they came, were eaten here too. A pot of cabbage soup simmered slowly, the steam mixing with the warmth and scent of old floorboards. Bread was passed around, sometimes hard from age, but always shared. The clink of mismatched silverware and the hush of careful chewing became part of the soundtrack of winter nights. And when the food was gone and the dishes stacked, the room grew quieter. Someone might pull out a deck of cards. Another would reach for the radio, adjusting the dial through the static to catch a story, a tune, or the president's voice crackling from Washington. The family listened, shoulder to shoulder, comforted by the sound of words filling the space between them. Bedtime was not a retreat to separate rooms. Often, mattresses or blankets were pulled near the stove, and children slept in huddled lines like kittens, their bodies sharing heat. A mother might hum softly, rubbing a little one's back. A father, already weary from a day of trying, stared at the flickering flame, lost in thought. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, In that one warm room, there was a kind of peace. It wasn't comfort in the way we think of it today. There were no electric heaters, no hot cocoa topped with marshmallows. But there was closeness. There was love. There was the understanding that surviving the cold wasn't just about temperature. It was about togetherness. It's easy to forget now how hard that kind of winter could be. But for those who lived it, the memory of huddling in that one warm room remains, not just as a memory of hardship, but as one of family, resilience, and warmth born from within. And just beyond those shared walls and glowing embers, another reality awaited. A home often filled with multiple generations, each adding their own strength, their own presence to the fight against the cold and the hunger and the long nights. Let's step through that doorway now and into the next room, where grandparents, parents, and children all lived side by side, learning how to survive together. In the heart of winter's stillness, after the fire had been stoked and the children nestled in close, a truth lingered quietly in the warm room's shadows. That room was rarely shared by one family alone. Across 1930s America, homes began to hold more than just parents and children. They held stories, generations, entire lifetimes stacked beneath one roof. When the banks failed and jobs vanished, many lost not only their savings, but their homes. Rent became a burden too heavy for young couples, and older parents found their pensions dwindled into dust. The answer was not found in solitude, but in togetherness. So doors were opened wide to relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins. Grandparents who had once helped raise the parents now lived again with the very children they had once cradled. 3 generations, sometimes 4, all tucked within the same modest house. Not out of convenience, but necessity. It was crowded. That much is certain. Rooms once meant for one now slept 2 or 3. Children learned to share not just toys, but space, sleeping foot to foot or side by side, whispering softly into the night. Furniture was moved, mattresses laid out on living room floors. Every inch of the home earned its keep, and yet, in that closeness, something beautiful stirred. Grandmothers returned to kitchens they once commanded, their hands instinctively measuring flour without cups. Grandfathers, long retired, taught the little ones how to whittle wood or fix broken chairs. Teenagers ran errands for frail elders, who in turn told stories of a time before the Great War. These weren't just houses. They were vessels of memory, of resilience. The wisdom of the old wasn't stored in books. It was passed from rocker to child's ear in a hush of evening, as the wind howled outside and the world felt uncertain. You know, a grandfather might begin, rocking slowly. Back in my day, winters were even colder, and the room would grow quiet, not from disbelief, but from reverence. The roles in the house blurred and shifted like shadows on the wall. A young mother might be mending socks by firelight while her father repaired a broken door hinge. A teenage son would head to the railroad yard at dawn to find odd jobs, while his grandmother kept watch over the stew pot bubbling gently through the day. There were arguments, of course. Too many people. Not enough space. Privacy was a rare luxury, and tempers sometimes frayed. But even the tension came with understanding, because everyone knew. This was survival. This was family, holding each other up, holding each other in. And when food was short, because it often was, It wasn't just one family feeling the sting. It was all of them, together, stretching meals, sharing bread, skipping seconds so the children could eat first. It wasn't always fair, but it was real. The laughter, too, found a way in. Game nights at the dinner table, a baby's first steps cheered on by 5 generations of feet. Aunts and uncles singing old folk tunes while peeling potatoes. These weren't grand moments, but they were lasting ones. They stitched the fabric of memory tighter, held together not by thread, but by love. There's something deeply human about hearing footsteps in the hallway at night and knowing they belong to someone who shares your blood. Something grounding about smelling your grandmother's bread and your uncle's pipe smoke in the same room. Something sacred about waking each morning surrounded not by things, but by people who would do anything to help you make it through. As the Depression wore on, these multi-generational homes became more than just a solution. They became sanctuaries. And though the walls were thin and the nights sometimes tense, they offered something rare during a time of scarcity, a sense that no one had to face it all alone. And yet, even under one roof, there remained one haunting worry that lingered every evening. Would there be enough food for tomorrow? Would the pantry offer more than hope? Let's turn now from the warmth of these crowded, loving homes to the quiet anxiety that waited in the kitchen cupboard. A chapter not only of hunger, but of endurance. The walls of those crowded homes may have echoed with stories and laughter, but they also held a quieter, more persistent companion. Hunger, not the kind that passes after a skipped lunch, but a deeper hunger, one that clings to the ribs and creeps into the soul. A hunger that haunted the kitchens of 1930s America like a silent shadow. Each morning began not with choice, but with calculation. Mothers stood in front of cupboards like generals surveying dwindling supplies. A handful of beans, half a loaf of bread, maybe a bit of lard if they were lucky. There was no luxury of asking, "What do we want for dinner tonight?" The real question was, how can we stretch this just one more day? Children grew up knowing that seconds weren't guaranteed. Many had learned, early on, the art of pretending they weren't hungry anymore, just to make sure their younger siblings could have a little more. No one wanted to take the last bite, and often, there simply wasn't one. The pantry wasn't empty all at once. It was a slow erosion, one can missing here, one bag of flour gone there, until suddenly the shelves held nothing but dust and quiet hope. Families rationed everything. Milk was watered down. Meat, when it could be found, was minced and spread thin into soups or casseroles, stretched with potatoes, cabbage, or whatever was growing out back. Bread was made from scratch, often without yeast. Butter was replaced with drippings. Sugar became a luxury to be saved for Christmas. If at all, food wasn't just scarce, it was precious. And with that came a strange kind of reverence. Even children understood it. A crust of bread dropped on the floor wasn't discarded. It was brushed off, kissed by instinct, and eaten without complaint. No one wasted. No one dared. And yet, even in the struggle, families tried to preserve a sense of dignity. Guests, if they came, were always offered something, even if it meant someone in the household went without. It was an unspoken rule, an act of quiet hospitality that somehow survived the Depression. You feed others, even when you can barely feed yourself. Some of the hunger lived in the stomach, but much of it lived in the heart. There was a hunger for normalcy, for the kind of meals they used to have, the ones with smells that filled the home and laughter that rose from full bellies. A hunger for security, for the days when a grocery list could be written with confidence, not fear. Fathers, unable to provide like they once did, carried an invisible weight. Mothers, turning scraps into meals, carried the burden of watching their children eat just enough, but never truly be full. The shame of hunger was heavy, but heavier still was the silence. Neighbors didn't always talk about it. Pride kept the words stuck behind tight smiles and polite nods, but everyone knew. You could see it in the thinness of the children, in the empty windowsills where pies no longer cooled, in the way grocery lists were tucked away, forgotten. Still, they endured. They found ways to stretch what little they had. They borrowed from neighbors, swapped recipes, traded garden vegetables, and leaned on each other without ever truly saying the words, "We're starving." It wasn't just about feeding the body. It was about preserving the soul of the family, the traditions, the rituals, the Sunday suppers. Even if it was just soup and bread, they refused to let go of the table, no matter how bare it became. And behind it all, there was always the whisper of hope. That maybe next week would be better. That maybe work would come. That maybe spring would bring more than just sun, but enough harvest to fill the shelves again. From the scarcity came something else too. A resilience, and a kind of creativity that turned the humblest ingredients into meals that sustained more than just the body. Because sometimes it wasn't about how much food you had. It was about how you made it stretch, how you made it matter. And so, as pots simmered and prayers rose with steam, something sacred unfolded in those kitchens. Not abundance, but determination. Not feasts, but fierce love. And in the next breath, we'll open those pantry doors again, not to weep, but to see how ingenuity took root in the form of cabbage soup, wartime casseroles, and the quiet magic of making something from almost nothing. If the scarcity of food was the storm that loomed over every household, then what came next was the quiet act of resistance, making something from almost nothing. It was in those bare kitchens, with squeaky cabinet doors and half-filled jars, that the real creativity of Depression-era America unfolded. Recipes weren't followed, they were invented. Cookbooks gave way to memory, instinct, and hope, and at the heart of so many meals was a humble, leafy friend. Cabbage. Cabbage soup, simple, steamy, and endlessly adaptable, became the unofficial dish of the decade. It welcomed whatever was left in the pantry. A potato, some onion skins, a stray carrot if one could be found. Meat was rare, but if someone had a bit of ham bone or bacon grease, it went into the pot like treasure. The broth simmered slowly on the stove, filling the home with warmth that wasn't just physical. It was emotional, too. That smell didn't mean you'd be full, but it did mean there'd be something. In many homes, that pot of cabbage soup lasted for days. It was stretched thin with water, thickened with starch, and flavored with imagination. The vegetables changed depending on what neighbor could spare a handful, or what a child brought home from foraging near the edge of town. Some families even used saved pasta water to enrich the broth, a small act of thrift that made a big difference. Casseroles were another favorite, not because they were easy, but because they were forgiving. In baking dishes patched with cracks, mothers and grandmothers layered beans, noodles, breadcrumbs, and a few slivers of meat or cheese. Seasonings were minimal, maybe some salt or pepper if it hadn't run out, but the love was rich, even when the flavor wasn't. Leftovers were never left over. Yesterday's soup became tomorrow's stew. Cold mashed potatoes were turned into pan-fried cakes. Rice was repurposed into puddings with just a drop of milk and a sprinkle of sugar saved for such rare moments. These meals weren't just food, they were rituals. They were a testament to endurance, to ingenuity, to the quiet pride of feeding a family against all odds. And though the dishes may have lacked presentation, they were served with reverence. Plates were scraped clean, not because someone said to, but because there was nothing else. Not a crumb was wasted. Even the water used to boil vegetables was saved to make broth for another meal. Children learned early that enough was a relative term. They didn't grow up with snacks or sweets. They grew up knowing that a piece of toast and soup was dinner, that a spoonful of peanut butter was gold, that jelly made from dandelions or crab apples was just as special as anything from a store. And still, somehow, they smiled. Not because they were full, but because they were together. Mealtime became a moment of pause, a time when the worries of bills and weather and work could rest, if only for a little while. When stories were passed around with the same care as the bread. When a child's laughter over a silly shaped potato became the dessert everyone needed. Even today, those recipes live on, not in cookbooks, but in memory, in families who still make cabbage soup on cold days, in kitchens where someone adds a little of this and a little of that, just like Grandma did. And though the ingredients have changed, the spirit hasn't, because it was never about what was on the plate. It was about the hands that prepared it, the hearts that shared it, and the quiet courage it took to make a meal in the middle of a storm. As the soup cooled and dishes clinked into the sink, there was no applause, just a nod, a sigh, and a lingering scent that said, "We made it through another day." Up next, we'll step outside those kitchens and into the gardens, small patches of hope that began to spring up in every empty lot and backyard, where seeds were planted not just for food, but for the future. As pots simmered with cabbage soup and every scrap of food was stretched to its last breath, another quiet revolution was taking place. Outdoors, in the dirt, backyards became battlegrounds of survival. Front lawns turned into furrowed rows of hope. They called them victory gardens, though there wasn't yet a war. Later, during World War II, that term would become famous. But in the 1930s, these homegrown plots were simply acts of necessity and resilience. For many families, a packet of seeds felt as valuable as a paycheck. If you could coax tomatoes from the soil or gather a few beans from your own vines, you were ahead of the hunger. If your carrot survived the frost or your onions didn't rot, you'd have something to stew, something to eat, something to share. It didn't matter if you had experience. You learned. From neighbors, from elders, from trial and error. You read old almanacs or clipped tips from local newspapers. You watched the sun, felt the soil, followed the phases of the moon, not because it was romantic, but because it mattered. Even children helped. Tiny hands tilled small plots with rusted tools. pulling weeds and chasing away birds. They learned the rhythm of life from the garden: plant, wait, tend, hope. Sometimes fail. But even failure taught them something. Vacant lots became thrift gardens, shared spaces where communities worked side by side, shoulder to shoulder. People who had nothing left to give found something in the soil. Maybe it was peace. Maybe it was purpose. Maybe it was a single zucchini, handed proudly to a neighbor. In cities like Detroit, Pittsburgh, and St. Louis, abandoned land was transformed into green, growing sanctuaries. Rows of cabbage, turnips, beets, and corn took the place of empty bottles and broken bricks. And the people came, each with a shovel, a seed, and a silent prayer. Gardening became more than food. It was therapy. It gave aching hands something to do. It gave tired minds something to plan. It gave grieving hearts something to nurture. A man who'd lost his job could still tend his tomatoes. A widow could still grow beans along her fence. A child could watch squash blossoms open like small victories in the sun. And sometimes the garden fed more than just one family. Neighbors exchanged baskets across fences, traded seeds like currency, and swapped recipes alongside the harvest. "I've got too many cucumbers," someone might say. "Well, I've got extra dill," another would reply. And suddenly, there was a jar of pickles on someone's shelf. Preserving food became its own ritual. Canning jars lined the pantries like quiet trophies. Rows of amber peaches, ruby tomatoes, golden corn, each one a promise. We'll get through winter. We'll make it through. Even the act of watering became a lesson in patience. You couldn't rush growth. You couldn't force the earth to give more than it had. But you could show up every day, in sun or in wind, and give it your care. That was enough. Because in the 1930s, a garden meant more than vegetables. It meant independence. It meant a reason to believe in tomorrow. It meant that even in a world broken by banks and storms and dust, something could still bloom, and bloom it did. Bright rows of marigolds were planted in the edges, not just to repel pests, but to bring beauty back to lives dulled by gray. Children picked them and ran inside with dirty fingers and toothy grins. Mothers tucked them into jars on windowsills. Even the smallest color brought warmth. From the gardens grew not only food, but community, dignity, and faith. And as the seasons turned and the harvest came in, families gave thanks, not for abundance, but for enough, just enough. In the next part of our story, we'll return to the kitchen table. But this time, not everyone has a seat. Some families, burdened by scarcity, faced a heartbreaking choice. Who would eat today, and who would have to wait? In the 1930s, a kitchen table was more than just a place to gather. It was a battlefield, a quiet one, lined with chipped plates and heavy silences. And sometimes, not everyone had a seat. Hunger didn't knock politely in those days. It barged in. It reshaped how a family lived, how a mother planned, and how children learned the harsh mathematics of survival. Some households found themselves practicing something heartbreaking, something that no one talked about unless they'd lived through it. Eating in shifts, not because the kitchen was too small, or because the table couldn't fit everyone, but because there simply wasn't enough food. In some homes, only the children ate dinner. Parents, worn and weary, sat with empty plates and forced smiles, pretending they weren't hungry. They'd whisper, "I already ate," or "I'm just not feeling well tonight." But their children, even young ones, knew the truth. They'd seen the cupboards. They'd counted the potatoes. Other families rotated meals by day. One night, the oldest son might have a small bowl of soup. The next night, it was his sister's turn. A strange rhythm formed, a hunger schedule. And in between those turns, a quiet ache lingered. Not just in stomachs, but in hearts. There are stories, real stories, of children pretending to be full just so their siblings could have more. Of grandparents giving up their only piece of bread to a toddler too young to understand sacrifice. Of mothers, thin as shadows, boiling broth with nothing but bones and salt, and still making it taste like love. Sometimes there was food, but not enough for all at once. So one person would eat while the others looked away or left the room altogether. They couldn't bear to watch. The guilt of eating when your brother was still hungry, it settled deep in the bones. It never really left, and yet somehow grace bloomed in that suffering. A child who once gave up his portion grew into a man who never let his own kids go without. A mother who rationed breadcrumbs became a grandmother who filled every guest's plate to the brim, even decades later. The memory of hunger became the soil where empathy grew. There were moments, rare, fleeting, when neighbors would knock. "Come eat with us tonight," they'd say. "We made too much." Everyone knew it wasn't true, but no one questioned it. Sometimes families would come together, not for feasts, but for dignity. A half apple shared between three was still an apple. A bowl of beans passed down the line still filled someone's belly. And the act of giving, of choosing another's hunger over your own, became the purest form of love. And in the background of all this, the garden still grew. Tomatoes ripened slowly. Cabbages plumped. Carrots peeked from the soil. But until harvest came, families waited. They waited through the ache, through the thin weeks, through the quiet despair of empty shelves and empty pots. And they hoped, because somehow, hope lived between bites. It lived in the scraping of a spoon against the bottom of a tin plate. It lived in the gentle, "You go ahead and eat. I'm fine." It lived in eyes that met across the table, not with bitterness, but with understanding. In the next part of our story, we step into one of those rare and precious moments when hunger met kindness, not from within the home, but from the community itself. When each family brought just a little, and together they created enough. In a time when dinner tables often sat half empty, the idea of a potluck dinner felt like a quiet miracle. It wasn't about abundance. No one was bringing honey-glazed hams or fresh pies. Most dishes were simple: potato hash, bean stew, a dry loaf of bread sliced thin to make it stretch. But what made these meals special wasn't what was on the plate. It was the spirit behind them. Neighbors would gather in church basements, barns, or someone's front yard. No invitations were needed, just the understanding that everyone brought what little they had. And together, it became enough. One family might show up with a pot of boiled cabbage. Another might offer a dish of stewed apples, soft and cinnamon-scented from a tree that had managed to bear fruit that year. A child might carry a small plate of corn fritters, fried with care and pride, though they'd already been reheated twice. And in that act of sharing, something happened. People laughed again. Stories were told. Music might drift from a harmonica or someone's old fiddle. And for a few short hours, the weight of the Great Depression lifted. It wasn't just about the food, it was about dignity. In a world that had taken away so much, jobs, savings, homes, potlucks gave people back a sense of agency. You might not have had enough to feed your family all week, but tonight, you could contribute. You had something to give. And in giving, you found hope. Older folks sat side by side with young families. Widows brought casseroles made from scraps. Children passed baskets of bread, their hands too small to hold much, but always offering with a smile. And no one counted portions. No one kept score. It's said that during those gatherings, people didn't just feed their stomachs. They fed their spirits. They remembered what it meant to be part of something larger. A community, not just a cluster of houses. Sometimes these potlucks were organized weekly by churches or local women's clubs. Other times, they were spontaneous, a response to news that someone's crop had failed, or a baby had been born into a house with no meat in the icebox. In these moments, the entire town seemed to exhale. Pain was divided. Joy was multiplied. There are still memories, faint, treasured ones, of paper plates resting on tired knees, the smell of strong coffee brewed from reused grounds, and the way candlelight flickered off the worn walls of a room filled with quiet gratitude. And though bellies might not have been full by modern standards, hearts were. These meals were proof that even in the darkest times, the human instinct to come together, to share, to lift one another up, never faded. From the sorrow of eating in shifts, we now step into the warmth of togetherness, however fragile, however fleeting, because the next moment of comfort, of connection, might just come from a voice on the radio, crackling through the static. When the potluck dinners ended and folks walked home under starlit skies, the night didn't always go quiet. Not yet. Because in so many homes, humble, drafty, patched together with love, there was a little wooden box glowing in the corner. A radio. Its knobs worn smooth from use, its tubes humming faintly, like a warm companion whispering through the dark. For families of the 1930s, the radio wasn't just a source of news or entertainment. It was a lifeline, a flicker of the outside world reaching into kitchens and parlors, past empty cupboards and tired eyes, offering something rare: hope, imagination, and connection. Children would curl up on the floor with their hands tucked under their chins, eyes wide as the familiar sound of static gave way to voices. Maybe it was the shadow, cloaked in mystery and suspense. Maybe it was a cowboy galloping across dusty plains, or a detective solving crimes with nothing but clever wit. Or maybe it was the president himself, Franklin D. Roosevelt, speaking in calm, steady tones during his fireside chats, reassuring a worried nation that tomorrow still held promise. And when music came through, oh, how it changed the room. Whether it was a lively swing band from New York or a gospel choir from down south, that sound made rooms feel fuller, warmer, alive. A scratchy tune on a Saturday night could make even the weariest mother tap her foot while folding laundry, or get a tired father to smile after another day without work. Some families had to share one set among neighbors. Others sat in silence while the signal crackled and faded in and out, adjusting the antenna just so. Until finally the voice came back, clear and steady. It wasn't about the clarity. It was about what the radio meant. It was a window to another world. A world where people still laughed, still triumphed, still dreamed. For those trapped in small towns or stuck on dry, barren farms, that little box reminded them they weren't alone, that others too were struggling and surviving. In a way, the radio gave permission to escape, even if only for half an hour, to forget, just briefly, the aching worry of how to stretch tomorrow's meal, to gather around the soft orange glow and let the mind drift, to far-off cities, to stories bigger than their own, or to melodies that stirred memories of better days. It also became the heartbeat of the home. There was a ritual to it. Tuning in, turning down the lights, quieting the children. The way families once gathered around the hearth, they now gathered around the speaker, because that was where the stories came from now. It didn't matter that the voices were distant. They were real. And somehow, in a time of great emptiness, the radio made the night feel full. Even today, some elders can still recall the precise crackle before their favorite show came on, or the exact phrase the announcer would use to open the broadcast. Those memories have lasted nearly a century, not because the radios were fancy, but because what they brought was sacred. They brought imagination, comfort, and a sense that life, however fragile, still pulsed with meaning. So as the wind howled outside and dinner leftovers cooled on the table, the voices on the air gave families something to hold on to, one soft syllable at a time. And when the show ended and the light was clicked off, there was often silence again, but it wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that follows a good story, one that leaves you feeling a little less alone. After the voices on the radio faded into static, the room didn't empty. It simply shifted. The soft hum of the radio gave way to quieter joys, the kind found inside a worn cardboard box or scribbled in the corner of a paper scrap, passed between children like secrets. Because when the weather outside bit at the walls and shoes were too thin for play in the snow, the world of imagination moved indoors. In living rooms lit by kerosene lamps or bare bulbs dangling from cords, children found ways to chase joy, not with gadgets or screens, but with simple things, board games, puzzles, and their own imaginations. Games like Sorry and checkers made their rounds in households lucky enough to have them. If a piece went missing, a button would do. If a card tore in two, it was mended with care, because even these modest luxuries were too precious to discard. And when Monopoly entered the scene, well, it became a kind of ironic fantasy. Here were families with almost nothing, play-acting as tycoons on cardboard streets. They'd laugh at the idea of buying hotels, of collecting rent on boardwalk, even while their real homes might be shared with relatives, drafty, or only half-heated. But perhaps it was the absurdity of it that brought comfort. To play as if they were rich, to build something, even in fiction, offered a moment of pretend that felt a little like hope. Even those without store-bought games weren't left out. Old catalogs became coloring books. Wooden blocks became whole cities. A few buttons and scraps of cloth could become an entire cast of characters. Mothers handed over string for Cat's Cradle. Fathers taught card tricks passed down through the years. Laughter spilled from tiny kitchens and cold bedrooms. Not because times were easy, but because children, in their boundless brilliance, always find a way to make magic. And parents didn't stand aside. They knelt beside their kids on the floor. They rolled dice and told stories. In the quiet corners of hard lives, these small acts became the glue that held spirits together. They weren't just games. They were a soft rebellion, a refusal to let the world's weight crush the light inside a home. You might hear someone say later in life, "We didn't know we were poor. We just knew we had fun." And that was true for many, because when you're young, you don't measure the world by what you lack. You measure it by the warmth of the people around you, by the giggle that escapes when you win the game, by the way your older brother lets you go first, even when he's having a rough day, by the sound of your mom clapping as you finally solve the riddle she's told 100 times before. Some homes invented their own games, tossing pennies into jars from across the room, or hiding objects in a version of hot and cold. Anything that passed the time with laughter became sacred. Even the floor itself, bare wooden planks swept clean, could become a world of its own. Marbles clicked and spun. Dominoes tumbled. A jump rope became a fence, a gate, a race. In the 1930s, creativity was currency, and joy was crafted, not bought. And when the power went out, if there was power at all, the shadows joined in. Candlelight stretched across walls, turning fingers into puppets, faces into ghost stories. And in those flickering moments, homes became stages, and everyone had a role to play. Looking back now, it wasn't just about passing time. It was about reclaiming something. In a decade marked by scarcity and sorrow, indoor play was a quiet form of resilience. It was the sound of children choosing laughter over silence, families choosing each other over despair. And even if the pieces were broken, even if the boards were bent, the memories they built remained whole. So tonight, if you listen closely, if you close your eyes and let the static fade, you might hear the faint echo of dice hitting a table, or a child's triumphant cheer. And in that memory, you'll find not just a game, but a generation who learned how to dream indoors when the world outside gave them so little. After hours spent inside, sharing laughs over checkers and rolling dice by lamplight, there came a moment when the walls felt a bit too close. The air inside, though full of warmth and love, began to weigh heavy. And so, when the weather allowed, families turned their faces to the sun and stepped outside. Even in the midst of hardship, joy still managed to bloom outdoors. It wasn't about elaborate vacations or trips to far-off places. Those were dreams for another time. Instead, joy came in the form of fresh air, of a breeze against your skin, and of simple pastimes under open skies. And for many Americans during the 1930s, miniature golf became an unexpected beacon of light. Strange, isn't it, that in a time when food was scarce and hope ran thin, putting a little ball through a wooden windmill or over a tiny bridge brought such delight? But it did. Many golf courses began to pop up across small towns and cities. Some built from scrap wood and leftover bricks, others cobbled together by neighbors looking for a reason to smile. They cost only a few cents to play. And for that small price, a family could forget their troubles for an hour or two. There was something magical about those courses. The painted obstacles, the goofy challenges, the way laughter echoed down the lanes. It brought people together in ways that hardship often couldn't. Parents played alongside their children. Grandfathers offered pointers on how to angle the shot just right, and every hole-in-one was met with cheers, like a small miracle. You see, it wasn't just about the game itself. It was about stepping outside the shadows of worry, if only for a little while. About seeing Dad smile again. About watching Mom laugh, really laugh, as her ball bounced off the tiny castle wall and into the cup. Mini golf, in many ways, became a symbol of resilience, of how, even when the world felt bleak, people still sought out joy and made room for it, even in the most unlikely places. And it wasn't just mini golf. Children ran barefoot through alleys and backyards, their laughter cutting through the silence of empty streets. They played tag with patched-up shoes. Chalk drawings appeared on sidewalks, little masterpieces that vanished with the next rain. Boys built makeshift kites from newspapers and string, letting them soar against skies that knew no depression. Even a simple walk could feel like an adventure. Couples strolled slowly, hand in hand, along dusty roads at dusk. Neighbors sat on porches, swapping stories as the sun dipped low and the sky turned soft with color. Teenagers gathered near soda fountains, sipping slowly from a single glass, letting conversation stretch until the stars came out. The world outside became a sanctuary, a reminder that not everything had been lost. And in that fresh air, hope returned, quietly, gently. For all its sorrow, the 1930s also revealed something beautiful. That joy doesn't need money. It doesn't need glitter or grandeur. It just needs space, a moment, a breeze, a place to laugh without fear. So many who lived through those days remember them not only for the hardship, but for the strange, almost sacred simplicity. They remember the feel of warm pavement beneath their feet, the creak of a wooden mini golf putter in hand, the sound of their little sister's giggle as her ball made it into the clown's mouth on the third try. And though those courses may have crumbled long ago, though the paint has faded and the obstacles grown mossy or disappeared altogether, the memory of that joy remains. It lives in the way we still chase sunsets, in the way we still gather for games and laughter under the sky, in how we pass on those stories, not just of hardship, but of the ways we rose above it. And as we leave behind those playful greens and walk back into the wider story of the 1930s, we carry with us one clear truth. Happiness, even in the hardest times, is never fully out of reach. There's a certain kind of hope that grows not from abundance but from desperation, from the raw, weary cry of a people who've had enough of hunger, of dust, of empty hands. By the early 1930s, that cry echoed across the land. Fathers stood in soup lines that stretched around entire city blocks. Mothers tore old coats into blankets for babies born into cold homes. Children, thin and silent, stared out of train windows, watching familiar towns fade behind them as their families searched for something, anything, better. And then a voice rose above the static. It came crackling through the radios that so many families huddled around each evening. A steady voice, confident but calm. It belonged to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the newly elected president. And in his voice, many heard, for the first time in a long while, something they didn't expect. A plan. They called it the New Deal. It didn't fix everything. Not right away. But for a country on its knees, it was like the first sip of water after days in the sun. The government, once so distant and removed from daily life, now rolled up its sleeves and got to work. Men with shovels and sunburned skin began building roads, bridges, and schools. They wore denim overalls and steel-toe boots, and they came home tired, but proud. For the first time in years, they had a paycheck. For the first time in months, they bought bread without counting pennies 3 times over. Programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, and the Works Progress Administration, WPA, didn't just create jobs. They created dignity. Young men planted trees along dusty highways, repaired dams, and restored parks. Writers were hired to document American stories. Artists painted murals in post offices. Musicians played in public squares. Even the land began to heal. Farmers who had once watched their soil turn to powder were given education and tools to rebuild. Conservation efforts taught them to rotate crops, to plant windbreaks, to work with nature instead of against it. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Families that had once eaten in shifts now found their tables slowly filling again. Not with feasts, perhaps, but with something that had been missing: consistency. There was oatmeal in the mornings, beans and cornbread for supper. It was enough. And as the 1930s wore on, the New Deal began to reshape more than just the economy. It reshaped the relationship between the people and their government. No longer was Washington just a far-off idea. It became a partner, a lifeline. It stood not only for laws and politics, but for the belief that no American should be forgotten, no matter how poor, how hungry, how broken. And while the policies themselves were debated, and still are, the feeling they gave to millions of families was undeniable. A man could rise with the sun, pack his lunch pail, and head to a job with a purpose. A mother could tuck her children into bed, knowing tomorrow might be just a little better than today. It was not salvation, but it was something precious, a second chance. Looking back now, through the warm lens of memory, the New Deal isn't just a chapter in textbooks. It's a part of the stories we still tell at the dinner table, about Grandpa who built a bridge in Colorado, or Aunt May, who taught reading classes through the WPA, or that stretch of road that leads into town, laid brick by hands that had once trembled from hunger. In every corner of the country, the fingerprints of the New Deal remain. On sidewalks and schools, on restored forests and flood control dams, on the quiet pride etched into the faces of those who lived through it. And so, as this chapter of the 1930s draws to a close, we remember not just the hardship, but the response. Not just the sorrow, but the strength. Because sometimes all it takes is one voice on the radio, one plan, one step toward rebuilding together. And so the story of 1930s America begins to drift into the quiet, not with fanfare, but with the hush of a room lit only by the glow of a single lamp, the gentle creak of floorboards settling, and the steady breath of a family finally at rest. The New Deal had brought new hope. Yes, but long before the government stepped in, there were people, ordinary people, who stood in the gap, who faced each morning not with certainty, but with quiet strength, who made something out of nothing, again and again and again. You see, the 1930s wasn't just a decade of dust and soup lines. It was a decade of human resilience. It was the sound of a mother singing softly in the kitchen, her voice rising over the clatter of a spoon in an empty pot. It was the sight of children turning cardboard and string into toys, laughing as though the world were whole. It was neighbors sharing kindling, coats, and comfort, even when they had little left for themselves. It was a time when home wasn't a structure, but a bond, a feeling, a warmth that came not from the furnace, but from each other. Fathers, once proud and working, took whatever jobs they could, shoveling, mending, hauling, because dignity meant feeding your children, even if your name wasn't on the building. Mothers learned to stretch pennies into meals, to patch clothes so well they could last another season, to smile through worry because little eyes were watching, and at night, in homes dimly lit by oil lamps or the last glow of a coal fire, families gathered close, around radios, around tables, or simply under a shared quilt, whispering prayers into the silence. There's something almost sacred about the way they endured. They didn't have much, but they had stories, and those stories became lifelines, tales of back when bread was 3 cents, or when Grandpa walked miles just to work for a nickel. They were passed down not for pity, but for pride. Because even in the struggle, there was honor. Even in the scarcity, there was generosity. It's easy now, with full shelves and glowing screens, to forget what it meant to hold on, to scrape by with grace, to believe against all odds that tomorrow might still be kind. But the generation who lived the 1930s never forgot. They carried those lessons forward like heirlooms tucked into their hearts. They raised their children with a sense of gratitude. They taught them that happiness doesn't come from having more, but from needing less and loving more deeply what you do have. Tonight, perhaps you're listening while tucked beneath your own blanket. Maybe the rain taps gently at your window, or the hum of modern life buzzes faintly in the distance. But somewhere in that quiet, you can still feel them. The grandmother who boiled cabbage soup with a touch of salt and a whole lot of love. The grandfather who built roads beneath Roosevelt's plan, muscles aching but spirit intact. The boy who polished his only pair of shoes each Sunday, proud as a king. The girl who learned to sew at her mother's knee, dreaming of dresses she'd one day wear. They're with us still, in spirit, in memory, in blood. They are the ones who taught us to endure without bitterness, to share without fear, to hope without reason, and perhaps most importantly, to rest when the work is done. As this story comes to a close, imagine the soft crackle of the fire, the orange light flickering on wallpaper, the gentle static of the radio murmuring in the background, a child curled up in a chair, thumb tucked under chin, a mother knitting by feel, a father nodding off mid-sentence, newspaper slipping from hand. Outside, the wind moves through leafless trees. Inside, the warmth holds steady, because though the world was cold, they built warmth. Though the times were cruel, they remained kind. And that, above all else, is the legacy they left us. So tonight, We don't just remember the 1930s. We remember the people, their spirit, their stillness, their songs, their silence, and we carry it with us into our own uncertain nights. With courage, good night, America, and thank you for enduring.